Hello, everyone, and welcome to 90 Minutes to a Better User Stories and Backlog Management with your instructors, Kylie Costella and Miriam Adini. Kylie recently made the career shift from being a lead project manager at ThoughtWorks to being a senior user experience researcher at Google, where she is working to potentially improve user well-being for over 1 billion people. And Miriam is a lead product manager at ThoughtWorks, where she spends her time coaching enterprise clients in the portfolio management, product definition, and the software delivery phases of their product lifestyles. Check out the speaker bio icon on the bottom of your screen to learn more about Kylie and Miriam. And before we begin class today, I will point out a few of the widgets on your screen that you may find useful. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the resources widget. That's where you can download the slides and access the links that you may need for class. And at the bottom of your screen, you'll find the Q&A widget. This is where you can enter your content-related questions for our instructors to address during our session today. We also have a group chat feature available, and you can type in any comments that you'd like to share with the entire group here, that group chat widget. And if you experience any technical trouble today, I first suggest that you refresh your browser. If that does not resolve the problem, type your issue into the chat box or into the Q&A, and I will be happy to help you resolve that concern directly. And I do have to warn you, for those who are subject to regulated status, that the chat feature should not be used, and that the audience may include customers, vendors, or competitors of you or your employer. And if you choose to take advantage of the interactive features available in this training, and we really hope that you will, you are responsible for any information that you choose to share. And with that, I will now hand the floor over to our first instructor today, Kylie. The floor is yours.
Maybe while Kylie is coming, I can say hi as well. Hi, this is Mariam. I'm calling from London today. And I'm so excited to go through the next 90 minutes and talk about user stories and backlog management. All to Kylie.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Yeah, I am Kylie. I'm joining you all from, it's sunny today, Boise, Idaho. And Miriam's over in London. So we've got a couple continents here. And I've seen, we've got people from the States, from Germany, from Canada, lots of other places too. So excited to have everybody here today. Let's see. So what we're going to talk about today, just to get a general overview, I know I like to have a mental picture of where all this is going. First, we're going to start with a little bit of background of why we even have user stories. It might feel like a no-brainer to some of you, but it can really help to really think about why are we actually doing this in the first place. And then we'll talk you through, I'll do the first part and Miriam will do the second part of the steps that she and I tend to use on our teams when we're consulting or when we're working with them to turn those product ideas into a roadmap that's actually executable via stories. And then we'll talk more about the user story details. So Miriam will get into the details of that. And hopefully we'll save some time for questions as well as some time for what backlog management means to folks. The way we do love to do this is one of us will be presenting and the other will be answering the questions either in the Q&A widget, or the one that we love is the group chat, right? Which is a way that we can all feel like we're in the same room together, even when we're not. So please feel free to pop in any questions or comments during the course into that group chat widget, so that, you know, others, if you have the question, probably others do too. And then the other presenter can kind of be answering that, and it's a fun way to go. So hopefully this will be a good session for everybody. All right, yes, and we're starting with a very quick poll. It's only single select, so if you wear multiple hats, just pick the one that is kind of the best fit. But we love to know each time really who we're talking to be able to better tailor that to you all. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to click the area that you work in. What's the function where you spend most of your time these days? Go ahead and just click one of those. Looks like we've got 6% reporting, 19%. All right. Maybe just another 5 seconds or so. All right, we've got over half the folks, so let's see who we've got. Okay, a pretty good mix here. Looks like the biggest chunks are product management or strategy and software developers or testing, engineering folks. Excellent. We've got a little bit of designers. That's where my background is. Portfolio management, leadership, and other. We'll keep an eye on the chat too. Looks like we've got a business analyst, tech lead, Scrum. Awesome. Great. Okay. All right. Well, why are we doing this overall? What's a user story about? I think sometimes, especially those of us that work in an Agile environment, it can kind of take for granted what we're doing when we have user stories, and then maybe there's a template and we just follow that, but don't really question it. But we got to keep in mind that the whole reason that we're doing user stories and having a backlog is for a team to be able to operate more like that car on the left and less like the one on the right. We don't want people to, when they start a piece of work, to feel like they're stuck in the mud and feel like they need to figure out everything, and without not having the context, the appropriate context for the story they're working on. Miriam and I really believe and see in our clients and teams that when folks have the appropriate context for the story they're working on, they can just pick it up and run. And that will look a little bit different for every team, but the end result is that speed and comfort and performance of the team. Cool. Okay. If you're new to the idea of user stories, maybe you are, maybe you're not. When we say user story, we're talking about like a little description of a feature. Usually it's told from the person who would actually use or desire that capability. So that could be a user or a customer, or it could be somebody internal, right? But it's kind of like a plain language way to talk about what you're trying to build at that moment for a small feature or small piece of development. And then the backlog is a set of a bunch of user stories of a bunch of pieces of the puzzle of things that need to be built to make this product a success. All right, this is just a little sneak preview. Miriam's gonna talk you through all of these pieces a little later. So if not all of these make sense to you right now, that's totally fine. But we like to flash the slide twice so you can remember this INVEST framework and kind of cement that in your mind. Okay, so now talking about the context of a user story, we talked about that little blue circle representing a story. But in order for someone to be able to pick up that story and really execute on it quickly and be able to answer the questions that they need to when they're doing their work, they need enough context about why they're doing that and who it's for and what the purpose of it is in order to really execute well. So what Miriam and I like to do is start from the big picture when we're starting a project or a release or any sort of thing you're working on, and get everyone on the team understanding the customer they're working for, the journey that customer is on, the overall map of the product that you're trying to build, the slice of that product that is most important to get out the door next, and then with that context, the stories really can do their job the way they're supposed to. So if you're building a new product, this can look like identifying that target customer. It can look like defining that customer journey, creating the initial high-level story map and getting down into the details. But if you are working on a product that is already out there in the wild and you're working on a new iteration or version of that product, it's the same steps, the same context, but you just want to confirm that target customer, confirm the customer journey, right? So it works in both scenarios here. I'd love to know in the group chat if folks are mostly working on new products or products that are already in the wild. So we'd say like released products. So if anybody feels like chatting about that, please go for it. Okay, so not all of these words might make sense to you right now, but let's think about maybe small or valuable. User stories you've written in the past, if you've worked on these, did they feel like they always had value, that particular piece? Did they feel like they were small enough? Etc. We'll leave that in the chat as well. Okay, looks like we've got a mix of both mature and new products. Great. Awesome. Okay. Cool. So the highest level context we really need when we're working on user stories and building products, right, is who's the customer or user or person getting the value out of this thing. My background is originally in design, so this stuff about defining target customers is stuff that is near and dear to my heart. Very fun. So how do you choose a target customer as a team? Now there are books and blogs and university courses all about this. So, we're not going to be experts after this 90 minutes. And you might have people on your team that are in marketing or user experience that define these things and have a whole career built on that. So if you do, lean on them. But we also find that in a lot of teams, they don't have those resources available at all times. And so it's great for everyone to understand what a target customer even means. And so that can be defined a number of ways. It can be based on customer needs or user needs, like things this person wants to get done in their life or their job. It could be based on demographics, right? What's the general age and location where these people that this product is for are from? It could also be based on the value proposition, something that they are willing to pay money for, or sign up, or all sorts of things to get the value that your product is wanting, is trying to deliver. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Oh, one other thing I wanted to call out is we wanted to include this picture here of these drawings of different customers, because this was something Miriam and I did with a client. And as you can see, like, not all of them were artistic or, like traditional designers per se. Okay, the person who drew the person in the upper right probably has a little drawing experience, but you don't have to. You don't have to be a designer to have a passion for who your product is for, right? And there are a lot of really great templates online you can get that can help you evaluate your customer. Cool. So now in this course, we're going to be talking about a little bit of base knowledge on each of these things, like we just did about target customer. We'll also be sharing examples from a real world product that we've been working on. And we'll also be having an example that's more of an exercise for you all to think about a theoretical product that we can work through together. So here's an example from a real client that I worked on. This was an insurance company. An insurance company wanted us to help them redesign and build a version of their app for people who have that car insurance, right? And so the pieces of the app that we were working on right then was really meant for what happens when somebody gets in an accident and they have this kind of insurance. How can we make that process of from the accident to everything being resolved as be as good as possible for that person? So in order to do that, we had to know a little bit about who that person is. This would be at the level of detail you might call something like a persona, right? Where you've got a person with a name. We know we're assuming their age here. This is based on data of their customers. This was her first accident, and she's the policy holder, meaning she's not, the partner or let's say the babysitter driving the car. She's the policy holder here. And then the context that's important in this situation was the context of what was happening. She was in a collision. She was the one driving. The car's still drivable. It's not totaled, and she wasn't hurt, right? So we know a little bit about this person, and we know a bit about the scenario that they're going through. But this level of detail could be different for any product. And the important thing is to work cross-functionally or lean on the people that really, this is their bread and butter to figure this stuff out, to be able to define that. So our example for this course is going to be a book recommendation app, right? So kind of maybe forget that Goodreads is out there, and we're going to try to be making an app that helps, that's targeted for people who enjoy reading new books and want to receive and give recommendations on what's new. This is an idea for a new product. So, there might not be a ton of data, company data to lean on for this, but for this first version of the product, we think we're going to try to target people around 25 to 40 that live in London and work in tech and have English as a first language. These are just placeholders, right? Like whatever your product is, you'll be putting in the things that make sense here. maybe I'll pause here. Do we have any like questions we should take a look at so far, Miriam?
Not that I can see, unless people still didn't put it in the chat. So please feel free to put it in the Q&A or in the chat so that we can respond to your questions, can answer your questions very quickly.
Sounds great. Thank you. Okay, so once your whole team, and including every engineer, has a base understanding of who you're building for, you want to make sure that everybody can understand the journey that that person is on and the journey that they'll take with your product. What's the overarching things that it's going to be able to do for a person that is valuable? So when we talk about a customer journey, we're talking about, it could be a current customer journey, and it could be an ideal or future state customer journey. Usually is kind of represented as a series of steps, potentially linear, right? First a person does this, then the second step, then the next. But it can be branched or however the journey is for your product. But it's those steps that somebody takes within your product and within their context, right? So what's going on in their life and how is this working for them? So to do this, again, there are people who spend their whole careers doing this, so lean on them if you've got them. But if not, you've already identified who the person is, the customer, potentially, that's getting the value from your thing. And then you kind of just capture each key moment or step in the scenario. In the picture here, this was like we were together for a workshop and we did a bunch of sticky notes and then ended up typing those things out so that we could move them around and kind of see what makes sense. But underneath each key moment, ideally, you can include more details about that journey, things like the customer need or pain point, any supporting ideas or features, or things that might go along with that. So let me talk you through an example. So for this car insurance company and this app we were building, right, we need a roughly linear journey about what's going on. And we can imagine there's a timeline of events of someone who has car insurance before, during, and after they're in an accident, right? So first, there's, in this case, there was an awareness phase of like, hey, I need to update my insurance, and education of like really understanding what their insurance has to offer. And then, the oh no moment of the accident itself. And then the feelings and journey that happens after that. There's often like a lot of emotions in a situation like that. So in this case, we were using emojis to represent how this person is feeling along this journey typically, because that will help us better design for those moments. And then underneath, I had to gray some of this out because it wasn't fully shareable, but we put things like key customer needs and pain points. You can color code these things. You can say like, what really sucks about the experience right now during each phase, and also what would be an amazing ideal way that the situation could work out in that phase in the future. You can include all of those things. You can look up things like service blueprinting and customer journey mapping to get a lot of details about ways to do this. But here's one example of how we handled it for this particular project. Okay, so now let's look at that book recommendation app piece. So here's an example. This is more of an example that's within the product itself, because it's a product that isn't so tied to what's happening in your daily life at that given moment. You know, this person might have had breakfast. They might be on their lunch break. They might be on the toilet when they're using it. It doesn't actually matter, right? So in that case, the customer journey is more about the product, the experience and the journey within the product. So here's an example of how Miriam and I, when we put this example together, just kind of mapped out what this general journey or flow might look like. And there's a lot there, right? Like there's a lot of potential steps and features involved. But then that brings us to our next step, which is really like fleshing out all of that and then honing in later to your MVP or your next release. And for that, I'm going to pass you over to my dear friend and colleague, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Kylie. Thank you. So let's just first check out if there are any questions. There's a question: with insurance journey that spans more than one actual journey, there would be a very long backlog with lots of stories.
Yes, that's a really
yeah.
great point. And that's why, honestly, like I'm so glad you brought that question up, because that's why we don't jump directly into writing the stories, right? Because if we had every possible feature we were going to have in the future roadmap already written in stories and in the backlog, that's a lot of effort to flesh all that out. And it's not actually all needed right at once, right? Because it might take a long time to build something like that. So that's why we have that context and understand the whole map. And then we hone in on a certain part of it or a certain slice that goes through that experience, and really just define that and write those stories first. Because it's really more of the Agile way. You're not like in a great big batch waterfall way writing every story for everything you might be building in the future. Because let's face it, things change and roadmaps change. So like, let's put the effort in defining the detail of just the details that you're going to need next. Is that fair? What would you add to that, Miriam?
Yeah, I think this is a really good segment to the next kind of, not next, the next after next section, which we are talking about how to choose what to do first. And I think, as Kylie mentioned, you're right. There will be a lot of stories, but not all of them are needed kind of immediately at the beginning, or not for the purpose of the first couple of releases. So we can decide what path is the most important one to focus on to unlock stories, which we'll talk about it more in the next couple of sections. But that was a really good question.
It really was. So, and maybe this will help too with our perspective on backlog management as well. And we always get asked for more talk about backlog management in this course, but like the number one thing I think we would give as a recommendation to like not letting backlog management get super hairy and out of control is like, don't even put everything in there that you might possibly one day do, right? Like, just don't write all those stories. Focus it on what's coming up next and what's valuable at this point in time. But with that, take it away.
Exactly. Hope that answers your questions. I thought that would be a gargantuan ask. There were so many phases there. Yeah, definitely. It's not just this example, you can think about any other examples, whatever we do, there are always lots of things to cover, lots of maybe journeys to cover, especially if you want to really be comprehensive in terms of understanding all the aspects of the user experience and user journey, which is absolutely the right thing to do. But at some point, you have to narrow down to what is the most important thing to focus on first. So speaking of story map, let's just now, after covering couple of first steps, which is understanding the target customers, understanding the customer journey. Then now let's see what could be the story map or the things that we need to do to make that customer journey happen. Before we get to that, there are a couple of things that we want to go through in terms of like understanding a couple of like concepts here. The first thing is user stories, which is basically a tool for iterative development. And it's a unit of work that needs to be developed and needs to be done by the team to achieve the goal that we're looking for. It also is a placeholder for conversation. So it's a place that everyone can come together, talk about what needs to be done, and have the conversations that needs to happen for that specific goal that we want to achieve. And it's maybe something to remind us that we have to always focus on the value. We have to always think about what value you want to deliver using this user story. And also it helps provide shared understanding between the people in the team, because we are going to have conversations, we are going to have details added to these user stories. So it's really a great tool to help to bring that shared understanding to the team. Another kind of concept that we use is epic. It's basically a collection of user stories that belong to the same feature or achieve the same goal. It's more like a wrapper around a couple of stories that they related to each other, and they maybe focus on same area of the product, or they deliver same concepts in the idea. So that's how we can help us to group some of the stories together. And a story map is basically a tool that can help us organize the features and stories based on the user journey that we define. And it can be used to facilitate prioritization and also help planning discussions that we are going to have. So it's usually a very visual way of showing what needs to be done, what are the stories that we have, what are the features that we want to implement, and it helps everyone to be able to have that shared understanding of the work. There are a couple of steps that we followed before to create a story map that can help us a lot, especially if you have a team that not everyone is super comfortable or fast at creating this story map. This is a really good practice to do with your team, especially bringing everyone in the team so that they can see and they can kind of engage in the journey. The first step is to bring your high-level user journey. For example, what Kylie showed you for the book recommendation app or for the accident kind of app. Just bring that journey into the room so everyone can see. If you have any visuals, any wireframes, anything that you have that can help for people to be able to visualize that journey, that will be also super helpful. Then break each step into smaller activities as needed, and maybe set each activity as an epic, and then put all the kind of related things or smaller tasks that can be related to that epic underneath it. So basically, we want to find some themes in our kind of all the steps that we have, and try to group them together and call that kind of grouping and our epics. So we will show you in more example how you can do that. But this is the visual way of showing what we mean by grouping things into epics and breaking the stories and tasks. So imagine all these white cards are all the tasks that needs to be done in our user journey. So we try to put them together, the ones that are related to each other or they achieve the same goal, under some of those green cards that we call it epics. So now that we have a grouping that we know for each of the epics, what are the stories that needs to be done, or what are the tasks or kind of work that needs to be done. This is one of the actual real boards, story mapping boards that Kylie and I worked on a couple of years back. And it shows how you can organize your story map into and turn them into epics stories. But to make it more clear, let's go through the book recommendation app and show you what we mean by kind of splitting or breaking the journey into steps. So let's go back to book recommendation app. So this is what we covered until last step, customer journey. So we know the journey, how it starts. Start with opening the app all the way to doing everything that we want to do until they log off. Yeah. So we break this into smaller tasks. So as you can see, the first task that I broke into, the first one was open the app, click on the sign up, provide email, and sign up. So I put these couple of steps into sign up. And I put all the tasks that are related to sign up as a kind of epic into underneath that. So I say when people sign up, which is the first main step, they sign up with Facebook, they can sign up with emails, they need to confirm their emails, or they can sign up with Google, for example. The next main step that I defined is a login, which is my next epic. And in login, I added everything that is related to login, which is login, logout, forget password, reset password. Next is activity timeline, which people can see their friends' activity, they can like activity, comment on an activity. So this is basically all related to activity timeline, which I call it as an epic. My next main important step, which is one of my epics as well, is my library, which I can view my books, add a new book, edit, rate, or review a book, or even edit a book status. Another epic is recommendation with all the things related to that, and purchase a book, another epic. So this is how I split it and broke this journey into some really key main steps. And for each key steps, which I call them the epics in the gray box, I defined all the smaller tasks that are needed to make that epic happen. And this is what I call my story map. All the stories that I define for that specific customer journey are defined here, and I group them and kind of tidy up my board with defining some epics as well. So I know for each of those key steps how much work needs to be done to make it happen. So that's one of the examples of how you can create your story map. Before I move on, just want to see if there's any question that we want to answer?
Yeah. So there were multiple questions about like, if you're not going to make all your stories for the big giant product all at once, where do you put them? And so I just wanted to pause and like reiterate, I answered it in the chat, but like, here is a great place, right? You know, it says story map, but that doesn't mean that all these stories are written yet. This is like the map of the world of the stories, right? And so you can keep any feature ideas or like planned future stuff here in just a few words for each thing, right? Add a new book, log out. These are very simple, but it's a placeholder, and it can give everyone like a big picture overview of the product. But you can see how that's a lot less complicated than a backlog with, you know, this might represent like 300 user stories. You know, if a backlog of 300 user stories would be a little much to keep everything just clear in people's minds.
And also it helps people to have a focus, because when you have a lot of stories, a lot of paths, and a lot of things happening at the same time, it's really hard to really focus on one important thing and deliver it in a way that you want to deliver it with a good quality. So, you know, prioritization is always happening along the journey. When we are prioritizing which journey to focus on, when we are prioritizing which customers to focus on. And then when it even comes to stories, it's really important to see which one has the most important value that you want to focus. In the next step we talk about, as Kylie mentioned, you might find a story map with like 300 stories in it, or even kind of like a lot of things. But doesn't mean that they all have details, they all have all the information. We will prioritize later which one is the most important ones to even focus on and work on. And that's how we have in the next section about which is our minimum viable product or the next release that you want to work on.
Yeah, and there was one question that came up just now that has a great tie-in into, which is, you know, do these epics need to be worked on in a sequentially? And that's Miriam's going to talk more about that. The short answer is no, but about how to figure out which sequence and which pieces to work on first.
Exactly.
And there is one more question here that I think would make sense on this slide, which is how to identify the granularity of epics. Like if you had 2 epics sign up and log in, why isn't one just called authentication at like that higher level?
That's a very good question. You know, sometimes it goes back to teams' preference as well. Sometimes there are teams that, you know, or there are type of work that you might want to join this to, which is absolutely okay. You know, it's not always set on stone that this is the way to look at it. You know, this is an example to show you how you can put different stories under different epics. But for one team, they might prefer it to have it in 2 different, like sign up and log in. Another team might prefer to have it all in one. So this is going back to you and to your team, and you can absolutely change that. And that's also another way of looking at it. The point is how to organize them in a way that is understandable and gives value to the people in the team.
Yeah, and maybe one small thing I would add is it can also, one other clue of, you know, if your team doesn't have an answer for that already, can be like how many of these yellow cards, they can be any color obviously, but are under each one, right? Like if those were combined at the moment, that would be our biggest epic. Maybe that makes sense. Or maybe, you know, having 8 things to do within an epic feels a little overwhelming to the team. Like there's kind of some softer massaging to that too, of maybe you try to make your epics roughly the same size, but it's really up to you.
Yeah, that's so true. Is there any other questions? No, I don't see anything else. Okay, let's move on. So this is our story map. So we have reached step 4, which is now we have the story map. What is next? Now we want to know, out of all the stories that we have in the story map, where should we start? Where should we, one of the questions was, do we have to work in sequence? Absolutely not, because you know, you can work in sequence, you cannot work. It depends on what is the most important thing. And this is what is the topic of this section. So what is an MVP? You know, many of you here might be very familiar with the concept of MVP, which is minimum viable product. But basically is the minimum and very bare bone version of your product that has some really basic features. And the whole point of building this MVP is to be able to have enough features to be able to test and validate and be able to move forward and get early feedback from customers. It's a great way of providing feedback loop for any future development. So we want to find what is the minimum thing we want to do in order to start releasing our product, putting our product in the hands of customers so that we can get their feedback very early throughout the process. And that's what we call MVP. And it's very important to define a good MVP because, sometimes our stakeholders believe MVP is the big whole product. And that's the problem, because it might take ages to get to that MVP, while we can start with something very small, very basic, and start our way forward with kind of getting early feedbacks early and often. There are a couple of ways to define MVP. People have different kind of options and opinions. Something that Kylie and I worked in the past, and it worked really well, especially when you are with the whole team, when you have your stakeholders. And it's a great way to just kind of have a team activity around how to define what is our MVP for our product. These are the steps that we usually go through to define them, and it worked really well. The first is to bring all your epics and stories, basically bring your story map into the room. Even if you can visualize it on the wall, that would be even a bonus, and it will be great. And then create 2 buckets. One is called must have, another is nice to have. And start from the very beginning. Go through every and each story and assign them to either of these buckets, either must have or nice to have. And continue doing this until you don't have any stories left. And then go back to your must-have buckets and try to go through all the stories there one more time and see if there is anything that you can still move to the nice-to-have. Continue this process until there is no story whatsoever that you would think it can be moved to the nice-have. And that must-have bucket is your MVP, is your minimum viable product, is what is absolutely needed to be done, and that's the first kind of a big release that you can have. That's when when you have the product. We are building a product from scratch that can be used, this method. Even when you have already a product and you want to know what is the main major release, you can still do the same kind of practice, and what you have in the must-have bucket will define what is in your next release. And that's how we used in the past in terms of like what's the method we used in the past to create MVP with our teams. Especially this is a very interesting session usually we had with the team, because people at the very beginning, they know, oh yeah, everything is important, we want to do this, we want to do that. But when we start going through this exercise, especially when you have 2 buckets, and it gives you the opportunity to be able to compare some of the kind of stories with each other and see and compare to each other, you can see people will change their opinions when it comes to understanding what are the must-have, what are the nice-haves. Most people at the beginning think everything is a must-have. But then when they start comparing those with each other, when they start really putting some thoughts into like what needs to be done, that's how they change their mind. And it's a really good practice to do with your team, and it helps everyone to be on the same page, why we do some of the stories and why we don't do them now, some of them now, and we will do them later. Let's go back to book recommendation apps. So we got to the point where we define our story map, but there are lots of stories here, and we want to know what is our minimum viable product, or what is the next main release that we want to have for our product. So I'll go through all of these with my team and assign them to the buckets. And at the end, I got to the point where we picked these 6 stories to be in the must-have bucket. So the reason behind it was that we had this conversation with the team, and we thought for the sign up, we can start only signing up with one kind of means, which is like maybe Facebook, because that's the easiest one. It's already built in. We just need to kind of integrate it with our product. When it comes to login, log out, we need to have that, but maybe forget password and reset password can be done later. It's not a great experience for the users, and we know, but that's something that we can maybe leave it for later. Activity timeline, people want to see the latest friends activity. That's the whole point of book recommendation, as its name suggests. But maybe liking friends activity or be able to comment on their activity, again, can be done in the next release or later. When it comes to my library, I want to be able to view my books and add a new book to my library. But editing a book, editing a status, review a book, or rate a book can be absolutely done later, and these are nice to have. And the rest of the things in this product can be nice to have, because purchasing and recommendations is absolutely not necessary at this point. We just want to know if the bare bone version of this app or the minimum of this app is working for our customers. So we can put it in front of the customers after we have these 6 stories done, and we can start getting feedback. So that's the first release or MVP of our product, with these 6 stories that as a team we define as the must-have to work on. I'll just quickly check if there are any questions before we will move on. We have a very quiet chat today, which is very...
Yeah, no new questions. It is so much more fun when there is like a friendly banter and questions going on. So please feel free to pop that in. We would love it.
Yeah. Moving on is the story details. So we went through all the steps to identify a customer, the journey, story map. Now we know even what is our MVP. Now it's time to add some details to the stories. This is where we add the details. Instead of adding details in the story map step 3, which there will be lots of them, and some of them might not even be worked on later, we are going to focus only on the stories that we are going to focus on next. That's how we can make sure we don't put our time on something that might not be very useful. That's the most important thing to focus on now. So let's go through some story details and see what do we mean by that. So Kylie touched base on this, that we have some kind of criteria for a great user story to be called a good user story, which we call it INVEST, which is a kind of the short for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, and small. So when we talk about independent, it's very small. It's important for each story to be independent. We all know that the stories that are not independent, they make planning, prioritization, even development really difficult. We might have situations where people are blocked because someone else is working on another story which is related to our story, and that is how this development might be slowed down, and it will create really frustration in the team. So it's really important when we are defining and writing the stories, thinking about how can we make this story as independent as possible. We all know sometimes it's not fully kind of possible to make stories independent, but the point is to have that in mind as the first criteria and be able to know how we can make it happen as a team. Next one is negotiable. Well, user story is not just a written contract. It's an important opportunity for people to be able to have a conversation, to negotiate, to be able to kind of have that conversation with the team in terms of what needs to be done, how much needs to be done, how much needs to be covered, what way you want to do it. So having that kind of placeholder for a conversation is super important as well. So we just don't want to add all the single details to the story. We want to add the essential parts and also leave some space for conversations between the team as well. Valuable. When we are talking about stories, you want to think about, why do we have to do it? Why are we spending time and effort working on this story? And that's the value that we need to define in the story. It's very important to have a very clear customer or business value defined in it. And also think about the value as a kind of something that you can think, if you can give value to multiple people at the same time. If you can, we will talk about it in more details, but value can be also defined as a way to show different people what you are doing here and how they can get benefit from it. So think about what value your story is kind of delivering when you're writing details of stories. Also, it's very important for stories to be estimable. So basically, we are using stories for planning and for any kind of like communication that we have, especially with our stakeholders and with our customers. So we don't say that every story should be exactly known to everyone about how much time is needed, but we want to have some sort of ideas of how much possibly we need for this story. Some of the stories are super big. I personally worked on some stories that in 1 month of like development. And that's not very easy to be able to communicate, to be able to work on. And also people get really frustrated in the team with big stories like that. And it makes complication, definitely comes with big stories comes with complication, and also the dependency to other things as well, which might block us. So really think about how can you define some stories that you can estimate them based on your team. The estimation can be very different for different teams. Some people are might be very mature. They don't need estimation. They just can go with like understanding what needs to be done. But try to maybe keep, as part of the next one, is to keep them very small, or small enough that everyone can do it in a couple of days or in one day, or be able to, they can have a conversation with the team about what needs to be done. So it's really important to have that sort of small size and be able to estimate your stories. Otherwise, there will be a lot of kind of back and forth between the team in terms of what needs to be done, how much we need to spend time on it, and also lots of scenarios where you're blocking other people because the stories takes ages to finish. Maybe another kind of thing to think about is that if you have some track record of some of the stories already that you've done in your team, think about maybe having a retrospective for them after you finish them, and see how can you do it, how can you break the stories next time, how can we make them more independent, more estimable next time. And this is a good practice to have with your team, and gradually your team will get better at understanding what is the good size story and how best to kind of split them. And also the last one is testable. We want the stories to be testable. We want to make sure we test our stories so that we can ensure the quality is there. So they should be testable through either UI or through any other kind of tools. So we will talk about acceptance criteria and how to, but one of the ways to cover and cover the testing kind of aspects of the stories is to write acceptance criteria, and that can help us to understand the scenarios that we need to test later. But it's really important when you're writing your story, thinking about how our QA, how someone in my team can test this story later, and that can give you some understanding and ideas for future too.
Hey, this could be a great time to answer a couple questions too. So there was a juicy one about trade-offs between these pieces here, right? Like maybe the small and valuable, how do you draw the line between those things? And then another draw the line question that came up maybe for after that is more about, how to really draw the line about what are must-haves versus nice-to-haves.
So can you elaborate more on what do you mean by draw the line? But
like how to decide if so maybe there's a pretty important story. Is that a must-have or is that a nice-to-have? Like how to decide on those ones that kind of seem to fall in the middle.
Again, that's something that it might be very difficult at the very beginning, because obviously everyone says every story is important, especially the stakeholder. But the way to do that is, at least the way I do it, and I usually find it helpful, is to be able to compare the stories. Maybe you pick the first story and assign them to one of the buckets. The next one, you always compare it to the first one and say, maybe it is important to you, correct, but how important this is compared to the first one. And try to think about how can you go to a really good MVP as quick and as fast as possible. Sometimes a story might be important, but it's not as our immediate kind of preference, or as our immediate kind of things to go for as the first draft. And the more you do this exercise, the more you can have this conversation with the team and have better understanding. And also another perspective we can bring into the room is that who are your customers and what are they looking for? So for example, someone representing customer in that setting, in that room, can help you understand what are the priorities. So some people might say, based on what we heard from customer feedback, for example, this is the area that we have the most problem or we have the most issues. So if we can prepare something for this area, that will give us the best kind of first interaction with the customers, and that's how it creates the line. Or it might be a line from the business. Say we are suffering, for example, in this area, and we are losing, for example, money in this area. very much and compared to other areas. So this is where we have to focus on first to fix. And that's, for example, can be one of the criteria that you can have for your prioritization. But having input from business, from the customers are really helpful to drive that conversation.
Yeah, and it might be nice to even like assign a tiebreaker kind of role, right? You know, is it the product owner? Is it the product manager? Is it the tech lead? Is it like who gets to say at the end? Not that that person should be responsible for defining the whole thing, because we really do think it's best cross-functionally, but maybe there's a tiebreaker role too, could be another option. And then the other question, let's see, is about, trade-offs between these attributes here. So for example, valuable but being small enough. Like, is it really, basically this person is saying that they find it hard to create valuable stories that are still small, and like how to think about that.
I think sometimes even we can break the value into smaller chunks as well. The whole point is that we want to avoid having someone working on some stories for a couple of months while other people are waiting for this story to be done because they are dependent. And that complexity is what you want to avoid, and that frustration. So maybe you have a big value in your mind, but think about how you can even break that value into smaller stories. You know, sometimes a story is small, but the value is also something that you can put alongside other things that you have to create that big value that you have in your mind. So it's just all thinking about how can I break it into meaningful. Obviously, sometimes we cannot do that, and it's totally acceptable. You know, what we are talking about it here is just to show you what are the best practices. But obviously, we all have been in a situation where it's not possible and we have to go with the flow. But there are things that we can do to make that easier. One of them is to break it into smaller values, and that then can give you a value for even your small stories. I can see another question here. Could you please share your experience about best practices on estimating the stories and the degree of technical details they should have? What about acceptance criteria or definition of done? Well, it's a very good question in terms of technical details. Some stories obviously have a lot of technical considerations. Sometimes you have to decide about the tool, about the integration points, about everything that you need to have, which is a great conversation to have with your team while you're writing the story, because then with your team you can even decide to what extent you want to go with all those technical decisions and conversations. And then if there are any key decisions to be made, you can make it and then capture it in the story. Also, you can have criteria, acceptance criteria, which we will talk about it soon, about technical stories as well. Because, you know, when we are talking about a story, there are multiple aspects of the story to make it happen. It can be from customer experience perspective, from technical perspective, from user, you know, from business perspective. We are talking about all of these things in a user story, and we can cover all of them as part of our criteria or the details that can be added to the story as well. Which estimation method is better? It really depends on your team, in the context, in the maturity of your team. If you are a very mature team that they have worked on the product for ages and they know what it takes to do something in your context, sometimes even no estimation, which is very kind of famous these days, can be the way to go. You know, your team knows what to do. They just need to focus on what is the piece of work to focus and what they need to deliver, and they kick off. Sometimes if your team is not experienced enough and you haven't worked together for long, so you don't know each other well, the t-shirt sizing is another way to go. Maybe starting with just give random sizes to stories to start with, and then after each iteration of work, after the work is done, go back, review, and then gradually your team will get better at giving more accurate estimation. And then at some point you might get to that no estimation as well. So there are different ways to look at it. It really depends on your team and who you have in your team and how much confidence you have in the experience of the team working on this product.
Yeah. Maybe one more question for now. Someone has a question about the roles of product manager versus product owner and how common it is for places to have both. And in those cases, like who does what a little more. Again, I mean, the first answer is always it depends. I've been at companies that don't have any product owners and people that have both. Sometimes companies that have both will have a more of a technical program manager or product manager, right? And so maybe the product owner is a little more about the user and business, sort of like a business analyst, and the product manager focuses more on the collaboration between, and trade-offs between technical feasibility and timelines and stuff. But also sometimes it's the opposite. And sometimes there's no product owner and anything about like the customer and business need and stuff is kind of handled by maybe product makes a little more business decisions. And then there's a role like my current role, which is user experience researcher. That's more of like a customer success owner. It really just depends.
Yeah. Sounds good. I have a question here, which sounds like there are a lot of decisions are qualitative. While it fits the theme of Agile, is there any cases or scenarios that quantitative methods like pop chart will be used? Well, obviously, there might be some ways. I haven't used that much of that in my experience, but there are ways that you can maybe go back to the data and kind of do some analysis on the days that it takes, for example, for stories to be done, the complexity, the touch points of different kind of places, and then have some sort of analysis on how good equality, for example, of the story was in terms of like accuracy of the sizes, the time that it took to be developed and all of that. And then you can then get better at that by analyzing the data, finding some trends and try to pick up those trends and then try to fix it for next time. That's how I can recommend. But I don't know, Kylie, if you have anything to add to that.
Well, I think that's a great answer. Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to this piece of cake, which is very tempting. So when we talk about value, as I mentioned, when you write a story, you want to make sure you're focusing on value from different perspectives. You might think about customer value, you might think about business value, tech as a kind of like also another aspect. So think about this cake. When someone offers you this cake, you just don't want to have a slice of the first layer. You just want to have a slice of all the layers so you can see what's really coming up in the cake. So that's the same when you're writing a story. Think about from end user perspective, what value this user is delivering. For the perspective of the business, what is the important thing here? For the tech is also, if we can find easy, smaller chunks of work that can show the value to the tech people. And for everyone else, it can also allow a really quick feedback. So think about those layers of value that you can showcase in your story. So another thing is, what is exactly the things that you want to capture inside the story? We talked about the stories should be independent, it should be estimable, it should be testable, small, but what is the content of the story? Again, there are different ways to capture your stories. There are different ways to make it clear and kind of visible to people. But these are like 5 things that we recommend as a kind of minimum to add to your story. The first one is business and customer value, which is basically talking about what business value or what customer value we are adding to by doing this story. But so why are we doing this story in the first place? That's a main important question to answer here. There are different formats that you can follow, but one of the things that we easily use in our stories, and it helps really well, is the as is, I want, so that. So you can say as a role, I want to achieve this goal so that I can achieve this value. This is a really easy format to follow, and it worked really well in some of the stories that you want to have. So this is a very important part. Always make sure you have the business value and customer value very clearly mentioned in your stories. Next is acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria are the things that you want to kind of have in place, we want to describe the behavior of our system, of the user flow. And they can be used as test scenarios as well. So it describes what should happen at each of the steps, so you can trace them later. You can have multiple acceptance criteria per story, as the flows can be different, the behaviors can be different. And also, they're a really good tool to help you understand the scope of the story. So you can define that scope, so everyone knows to what extent we need to go for this story. And also, it helps to develop a shared understanding between the entire team. There are different ways of looking at defining the user's stories. This is, again, another format that we use a lot, the given, when, then. Given talks about the context. When an action happens, then the expectation is what we expect. So this is one of we can have multiple of these given, when, thens when you want. But usually when we talk about things, we talk about three main scenarios to cover here. The first scenario is the happy path, which is if everything goes as planned, everything is exactly what we expected, what should we expect to see? Sad path is when something goes wrong and what we expect is not happening. We have to make sure we show that to the users, and we have a plan as well, so show what is expected. Alternative path is when happy path doesn't happen. So there might be, we have to also make sure people have an alternative kind of way to show them what they can expect. And that's how we write acceptance criteria. Let me just give you one quick example. So one example I want to give you is like, just imagine you're on the Instagram app, and you want to browse a photo from your phone. So this is a very quick example to just show you how this given, when, then format works. So we say given user is on the home page of the Instagram. When the user click on the plus button, then they can browse a photo from their mobile storage. So that's just to show you one of the scenarios that we can write here as an acceptance criteria for this app, using this given, when, then. The next thing after acceptance criteria we can cover is any cross-functional or non-functional requirements, like accessibility, authentication, monitoring, security, compatibility with the different devices. If there is anything to be mentioned, anything about these areas that needs to be kind of working in this story, it's a great time to focus on them as well. The next thing is technical notes. Technical notes also very important. As I mentioned, if you're writing in a story which has some technical decisions to be made, a tool or a framework or a language needs to be decided, that's a really good place to capture the summary of your conversations that the tech team had, the decision that was made, to capture it there. So next person come and pick up the story, or they have all those kind of decisions outlined there. And last but not the least, if you have any design assets, any wireframes, anything that you think can help the people who are working on the story, can be added here as well. Especially if it's an UI story, or a story that has kind of some elements of like interface in it, it will be really helpful to add those wireframes that you have for them here, so everyone can see what needs to be done and how it can possibly look like. So let's go back to our book recommendation app and write a story together, so we can cover all those kind of things that we talked about, content of the story together, and see an example. So if you remember, this is my MVP. This is what we decided that we want to do in our MVP. So I will pick this story, add a new book, and I want to write the content of this. Let's start with business and customer value. This is the value that I wrote for my story. As a user of the book recommendation app, I want to be able to add a new book to my list, so that I can keep a record of a new book and that I read and I recommend it to my friends. So this is basically very clearly says at the very beginning of my story, why am I doing this story and what is the value? The next thing is to now talk about some of the acceptance criteria. So I will talk about a happy path first. So my happy path is looking like this. Given the user is on the book recommendation app and they click on add new book and they pick a book from the list, When they click on the add button, then the book is added to their book list. So basically I browse, I go to the book recommendation app, I click on the add new book, find the book that I want to add, and I add it. Very, very straightforward. This is the happy path. There might be an alternative path. Alternative path is, as I mentioned, when the happy path is not happening. So let's see together. Given the user is on the book recommendation app and the user clicks on the add new book, and the book that they search does not exist at all. So we want to make sure we show them right messaging here. So a message should be shown to the user saying the book is not found. So just imagine if I was on the app and this alternative path wasn't covered for me, it would be a really bad user experience because I search for my book, but I don't see anything. Whereas now we make sure that we have an alternative path to the happy path so that people still get the right message and we can give them a good experience. And if you want to really enhance people experience is to also have a sad path. Sad path is when something unexpectedly happens and we want to make sure we still give people this experience of knowing what's going on. So the sad part in my story is given the user is on the book recommendation app, when the user clicks on the add new book, and the system cannot retrieve the list of the books. Maybe the server is disconnected, internet connection is down, I don't know, something is happening. But we have to make sure we give the right messaging. Then the screen should show an error message with the associated code and ask to try again later. So this is very basically show how I cover 3 main paths with each of the functionalities that I want to describe in my stories using these acceptance criteria and the given then format. So time to answer some questions. Kylie, what are we doing? How are we going with the questions? So one of the questions is, how do you set the scope of a user story? How much is too much or too less? There is no way to tell you this is exactly the line you have to draw around the box of your story. And this is the discussion, again, you have with your team. A story can have maybe, I don't know, 100 acceptance criteria, or like these acceptance criteria sometimes can be really helpful to help you understand the scope, but sometimes can be too much. So it's always having this conversation with the team, and don't worry if you don't know the answer. Try to do 1 round of stories with the number of acceptance criteria that you think is right. And you do the stories. Next time when you're writing a story, you already have some knowledge from the previous experience writing the stories, you have some feedback from the people, and you can always make it better and better. So it's about learning your way around it and see what is right for your team. Having a retrospective at the end of each iteration, at the end of each story writing, especially at the very beginning when you're not knowing the team and the team hasn't worked together for a long time, is the way to find that kind of like to find your right way of doing things. So I have had this scenario that I didn't know what is enough for my story, to be honest, because the context was too complex, or the team was very new and not very still together. So that's what we did. We started with 1 round of stories, write the acceptance criteria, and then we had a retro. For one of the stories, we noticed that we didn't cover all the acceptance criteria, so the testing wasn't well at the next level. So next round, when you want to write stories, we brought the QA into the team so that we know that we have the right number of acceptance criteria that is aligned with our testing strategy. Or if you have too much, next round, we know what was too much from the previous stories, and then we took all the learnings on board and make it better. So the best way to do this is to do it a lot with your team and always learn from your experience working with a team. And I promise you, after a couple of months, you all know what is the right number of criteria on how to kind of define your stories.
So well said, Miriam. Maybe one thing that I would add too is just remind us of that slide about the BMW or whatever that fast car was, and the truck stuck in the mud, right? And so the right amount will be enough to get going quickly without an unnecessary level of detail and complexity that slows people down. So I guess if you had to err on the side of like a little more or a little less information, and you were just starting out and you hadn't had a chance to do those retrospectives like Miriam was mentioning, which are so amazing, maybe try like a little less would be good, because if it's too much, then you're going to be doing that for every single story in the future until you hear that it's a problem. So yeah, just talk with your team, run it by a few people, see what they think. Is it unnecessarily complex or wordy or detailed? Too.
Great, thank you. I have a question here. I work in a backend development, and we capture these things in the story like as a role I want to so that. But our developments are in a module inside a microservices architecture. So in these cases, what would the role be? The role, I think, if I understood the question right, the role the client module plays, or should we figure out how the customers would sense the value of development? Maybe one way to look at it is that, why are you doing this feature, whatever we're working on? Who is going to benefit? Who is going to use this feature later? Is it going to be somewhere sitting in another development team? Is it somewhere a customer indirectly using it? So think about who is going to get benefit from what you're working on. That can help you really understand who is the role of that, who is getting the value, and who you can put there as a role. But again, this can be a game of like understanding and kind of repeating something until Sometimes you might have to talk to different people, and to be very honest, I've been part of some stories writing that we started writing the stories and we stopped at the very first step, totally, because no one could really figure out who is going to get any value from this story. And that's the conversation that you want to have. That's the honest. I remember we were working on something, we would start an hour talking about who is getting the value, and we couldn't come to a concrete answer. And we stopped there. We thought, if we don't know who is going to get any value or benefit from maybe we are not. Maybe that's something that smells. That's something that we need to see if this is the right thing to work on. And we never worked on that story. I remember that, and it saved us time but without having conversation at the very beginning, without having this discussion that who is going to get the value and who are we doing this story for, we could have worked on the story and no one used it in the future. So it saved us time and effort. So, and as I mentioned, this is the first thing and most important thing to focus on when you're writing stories, about who is going to get the value and who is going to benefit from this story. And then sometimes you need to go around and make sure you have the right person and right role. Another one is when you start working on a not so well organized project that has a big backlog with stories not following the splitting based on invest principles or properly split into epics. What are the pragmatic suggestions to approach such a project or backlog management? I personally go back to the journey, or even try to practice going back to the customers as well. When you have a backlog of a lot of things that, sometimes it's really hard to go through all the items and try to assign them, whereas maybe it's time to come. Sometimes it's good to have some reset moments in any projects that you're working on. Maybe go back to where we are now. Who is our main customer? Who is the person who is going to get benefit from, or who we want to work in terms of delivering value? And then define a journey for that, and then pick the stories from your backlog that relates to that journey. I would say this is the way to go, and that's a way to just maybe have some prioritization in your backlog as well. I don't know, Kylie, what do you say?
No, I think that's a fantastic idea and answer. If I came into a project like that, my immediate desire would be to kind of throw all the backlog in the trash, which is probably not a good idea, but it's that same feeling of like, okay, what is the really important context right now? And can we all get on the same page as far as that? I also am a big fan of stuff like workshops and sharing the burden and the load, right? So once you make your customer journey and your story map of what are the main epics we have, maybe it's a good excuse to get together as a team and say, print these out on little cards or put it on a Trello board or whatever tools you're using. And, give the whole team 10 minutes to go through and everybody, move 5 or 10 of these stories into the epics they go in. Could be like another approach to kind of many hands make light work kind of a thing. But yeah, you could also just literally start over with a new customer journey that makes sense, story map that makes sense, right? Make new placeholder stories, and then kind of sequester all the old ones into a place where you could still find them if you really needed to, if a stakeholder really had brought something up that was huge. But yeah, I think you could do any number of those things to really bring it back to a manageable situation.
Maybe shall we continue? We don't have much time. I just want to make sure we finish all the slides, and then we can leave time in the end for the questions. So this is the wrap up of like what we covered in terms of starting with the customer, going through the journey, story map, MVP, and story details. But something we want to mention is that there is no perfect framework here. We might all have some ideas from, maybe you could get some ideas from what we explained today, but at the end of the day, it's your team, it's your situation, it's your project. So try to think about what you can really get from the INVEST, for example, framework, the 5 steps, acceptance criteria, but also think about what works for you. You might be flexible you might have to be flexible in some of the areas when it comes to your context and to your project. As important as is creating the backlog and clear backlog, it's important to have managed a backlog as well, because the backlog can be very clear, very good at the very beginning, but if we don't look after it throughout the journey of development, it can be a problem again. So having some sort of ideas that we can give you for backlog management, that backlog management on its own can be another 2-hour kind of conversation, but to just touch base on what you can do to manage a backlog is having a physical backlog. If you're obviously in a physical space with your team, is super important. Have a digital backlog is always important, especially nowadays that a lot of us are working remotely, and having that digital backlog that has all the latest up-to-date information of your backlog is super helpful. Having a weekly review with product owners and stakeholders, and these conversations is something that you have to have continuously with your team. Creating a backlog is not a one-off kind of task to be done and then you can leave it and move on. It's something that you need to constantly look at your backlog, look at your stories, understand where you are. Sometimes even your priorities might change. You might even along the way decide some stories might move to nice to have, or some stories might move to must have. Having your MVP constantly reviewed with your stakeholders, with your team, will be really helpful. Backlog grooming, that's something that you can do with your team. The more stories you do, the more knowledge you will have from your users, from your technical challenges, and then you can add those learnings in each time to new stories that you do. So having that sort of understanding of what you learned, add them to your stories, and have that discussion is important. Story writing is not one person's also responsibility. We believe story writing can be done by anyone in the team. The best way we can do it is to have multiple people working on the story writing at the same time, so we can bring different perspective into the room. We sometimes call it 3 amigos or 4 amigos, where we have multiple people, like a business analyst or a product manager, a designer or user experience designer, a QA kind of person, or a tech person in the team joining to write the stories. That's how we can make sure we bring all the perspective into the story. And so when you're writing a story, we cover as much as we can in terms of different scenarios and different things that needs to be covered. So that's also another great way of having for story writing. We have some class activities, which feel free to add to the chat if you want, which is what change you might now make in terms of how you write your stories in the future based on what you heard today. How will you get cross-functional feedback to identify what changes would best suit your individual organization? It's really something that we really like you to think about it. And if you have any comments, just please put it in the chat. And also there are further references. There are lots of books on how to write stories and how to manage your backlog. A couple of them here are User Stories Applied and User Story Mapping, 2 really main kind of books that you can read and helps you a lot. And there are some materials on O'Reilly about agility and beyond, the history and legacy of Agile development. That's also another very helpful reference for you. We will have QA for the next 10 minutes. But before we move to that, we would love to have your feedback. If there are any feedback, you have any feedback from myself and Kylie, anything about if you want to add anything, want us to add anything new to this course, if there is any new topic, and anything you have in mind that can help us make this course better, we would love to hear it. And we will go through Q&A now, and we have the next 10 minutes. If you have any questions, please put it in the QA widget or in the chat, so we will make sure we see it and we answer your questions.
Awesome. Here are a couple. I'll start with this one, which is about all that information that we put in user story, acceptance criteria, value, et cetera. Do we also need to do that at the epic level? And I think the main question is, ideally, whatever tool you have will sort of will list out all of those stories that are under it, and so the epic will kind of include that by default. But when you're creating that story map, you probably do want to have like a high level version of that as well. Do you do that on your projects, Miriam?
Yeah, but I think as I mentioned, epics are just more like a wrapper around something to just kind of bring that kind of to kind of group some of the stories together to make sure they are following the same thing or achieving the same goal. We don't need to add that much details to the epics, but obviously we want to add something to make sure that people understand why we pick these epics and what this epic is going to achieve. Mostly about the goal of that epics rather than the details of like what exactly needs to be done in this epic. It's just like about overall what this epic is about, and then the other details will be captured in the stories.
Yeah, great answer. There's another question about specifically converting functional requirements into user stories and epics. If teams used to write FRD first, so the functional requirements, and then translate them into stories, like do you have any processes for that translation, I guess, if I'm reading it right?
Which one are you reading, so Kylie, in the chat or in the Q&A?
In the group chat, second to the bottom thing.
Say it again, which one? How to convert?
Yes.
How to convert functional requirements into user stories and epics. It seems like FRD first and translate them into user stories. I would say they should not be translated in the story. They're part of the stories. When you're writing the story, think about what sort of cross-functional requirements you have for this specific story, and then try to capture them in a maybe separate section or along with acceptance criteria. It really depends on what sort of cross-functional requirements you're talking about, but that's usually how we recommend to do it.
Yeah.
Another one that I can see, which I'm trying to still see what does that mean, slide 49. Let's go to slide 49.
Yes, I think the question might be about not seeing any acceptance criteria around one of the particular things that we wanted to include in the MVP. And to that, I was just going to answer that this was really just like an example problem. So the stories aren't like totally perfect, right? And matched up to the epic and the MVP slice. It's a good catch, but I guess not the intention of the examples.
Exactly. That was just for showing you purposes, and it's definitely can be much better than this, and it can be more comprehensive. We haven't covered all of it. Just look at it as an example. Are there any more questions? I don't see any more questions in the Q&A.
Me neither. If anybody's got one, we'll stick around for a few more minutes. But also, hopefully, you feel inspired to make some changes and some efficiencies in the way that you're doing project planning and user story writing. If I had to sum up just like one, I don't know, word of wisdom concept we'd hope everybody would get is do what is right for your team. Like feel free to read the books and you know, follow a lot of ways that other people do user stories, but in true Agile fashion, like the real answer is what works best for your team. And it's all about helping them move like that car on the left and less like the car on the right, stuck in the mud.
And if you don't know, just give it a go. Yeah. Nothing will happen. Give it a go and you will have learnings. And either it works and you learn what it takes to make something work, or it doesn't work and then you know what doesn't work, so you won't do it next time. So it's always a good learning. So just by doing things, you definitely can learn a lot. Great. If there are no more questions, maybe we can call a day.
Awesome. Well, thank you so very much, Kylie, and thank you so much, Miriam, for both of your classes today. Also to our attendees, thank you very much for joining. Just a reminder that we did record this class, and you can access the recording within 48 hours on the same page where you joined us for class today. Also, as you leave, there will be a brief survey that will pop up on your screen. Please take a moment and complete that survey. It really, really helps us out. All right, everybody, thank you again. Goodbye.
Bye.